The rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 42nd floor sounded like handfuls of gravel thrown against the tempered glass. Tuesday, 8:47 in the evening. The Manhattan skyline usually offered a glittering tapestry of ambition and wealth, but tonight it bled into a hazy, indistinct smear of neon and sodium vapor beneath the unrelenting deluge. Inside the boardroom of Kensington Financial, the climate control maintained a perfect sterile 68 degrees, yet the air felt suffocatingly thin. The scent of expensive leather chairs mingled with the sharp, metallic tang of genuine fear. Claire Kensington sat at the head of the immense mahogany table. 36 years old, chief executive officer. She wore a tailored charcoal suit that functioned more as armor than clothing, her posture rigidly vertical, her expression locked into the glacial mask that had earned her a reputation as the most unforgiving operator in the financial district. But the mask was cracking. The microscopic tremor in her hands, hidden carefully beneath the edge of the table, betrayed the catastrophic reality of the moment. The projection screen behind her illuminated the room with a harsh, unforgiving light, displaying a single devastating spreadsheet. $47 million. Gone. Evaporated into a labyrinth of offshore shell companies. At the opposite end of the table stood Arthur Pendleton, chief financial officer. 55 years old, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, his bespoke navy suit draped flawlessly over shoulders that had spent 3 decades navigating the treacherous currents of corporate warfare. He possessed the terrifying calm of a predator watching a snare pull tight. The laser pointer in his hand traced a slow, deliberate circle around the digital signature at the bottom of the authorization form. Claire's signature. "The board convenes at 9 tomorrow morning." Arthur's voice carried the smooth, resonant baritone of a man utterly certain of his victory. "The evidence is incontrovertible, Claire. The transfers were initiated from your secure terminal. The routing numbers trace directly back to entities registered under your personal holding company in the Caymans. The authorities will have the warrants by noon." Claire stared at the illuminated numbers. The betrayal was so absolute, so meticulously engineered, that it possessed a kind of cold, geometric beauty. She had spent her entire adult life building walls, sacrificing personal connections, sleep, and warmth to protect the legacy her grandfather had built. And Arthur, the man who had mentored her, the man who had stood beside her father's hospital bed, had spent those same years quietly laying the explosive charges beneath her foundation. "You orchestrated this." The words scraped out of her throat, brittle and dry. "You buried the subledger algorithms beneath the quarterly acquisitions. You hijacked the dual authentication protocols when I was in London." Arthur offered a smile that did not reach his pale, calculating eyes. "A compelling narrative. Unfortunately for you, the digital forensics point in exactly one direction. Resign tonight. Sign the non-disclosure agreements. Hand over your voting shares. If you do, I will personally ensure the board handles this as an internal restructuring rather than a criminal matter. You walk away with nothing, but you walk away free." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bone. Claire calculated the angles, searching desperately for a leverage point, a systemic flaw in his presentation. But the trap was airtight. He had manufactured a perfect execution. She was completely, entirely alone. The heavy oak doors at the far end of the boardroom groaned open. The rhythmic, high-pitched squeak of rubber wheels against polished marble shattered the tension. A heavy gray plastic janitorial cart rolled into the room, pushed by a tall, broad-shouldered black man in faded blue coveralls. David Brooks kept his head down, his movements slow and deliberate, projecting the cultivated invisibility required of the night shift, 39 years old. His hands, gripping the handle of the cart, were calloused and strong, the knuckles dusted with the faint residue of industrial bleach. He pushed the cart past the rows of empty leather chairs, the squeak of the wheels mocking the high-stakes execution taking place at the table. Arthur snapped his fingers, a gesture of profound, aristocratic irritation. "Out! This floor is closed." David did not stop. He maneuvered the cart to the edge of the mahogany table directly between Arthur's line of sight and Claire's frozen form. He reached into the side pouch of his coveralls, his movements steady, betraying none of the subservience his uniform implied. He withdrew a single folded sheet of paper. He did not look at the chief executive officer. He did not look at the chief financial officer. The paper landed on the polished wood with a soft, definitive slap. Page 4 of the Cayman Registry. David's voice was a low, resonant rumble, devoid of deference, devoid of fear. The proxy routing number matches the Caymans, but the origin IP timestamp for the holding company establishment predates the CEO's tenure by 6 years. The shell wasn't built to receive the $47 million. It was built to launder the previous deficit. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet. Arthur's face flushed a sudden mottled purple, the mask of the sophisticated predator slipping to reveal something vicious and raw beneath. He took a step forward, his fists clenching at his sides. "What the hell is this?" Arthur's voice cracked. "Security! I want this man detained." David retrieved his mop from the side of the cart. He submerged the heavy cotton strings into the bucket of blue chemical water. He wrung it out with slow, methodical pressure. He finally lifted his head, his dark eyes locking onto Arthur's. There was a profound, immovable weight in that gaze. It was the look of a man who had survived the absolute worst the world could inflict and had long ago ceased to be intimidated by suits and titles. "You missed a decimal on the secondary ledger." The mop hit the marble floor with a wet slap. "Check the routing sequence from 2021. The origin traces back to a defunct subsidiary in Delaware. Your subsidiary." Claire snatched the paper from the table. Her eyes darted across the printed lines of code and financial routing data. It was raw server log data, the kind of deeply buried forensic evidence that required an expert to unearth. It proved nothing definitively in a court of law yet, but it provided the exact thread she needed to pull to unravel Arthur's entire narrative. It was a lifeline thrown into a drowning pool. Arthur stared at the janitor, processing the impossibility of the moment. The man in the faded coveralls had just demonstrated a level of forensic accounting comprehension that exceeded the company's entire auditing department. David pushed the mop in a wide, sweeping arc. He turned his back on the two most powerful people in the building. He pushed the squeaking cart toward the secondary exit, leaving the boardroom to its scents and the faint, stinging scent of ammonia. The descent in the service elevator was agonizingly slow. The metal cage rattled within the concrete shaft, the fluorescent light overhead flickering with a dying, erratic pulse. David leaned his forehead against the cool steel wall, closing his eyes as the adrenaline slowly drained from his bloodstream, leaving behind the heavy, familiar ache of exhaustion. He had broken his own protocol. He had spent 3 months in this building, pushing this cart, emptying these trash cans, scrubbing these floors, maintaining absolute invisibility. He had swallowed his pride, enduring the dismissive glances and the casual disrespect of the executive class, all to gain unfettered, unmonitored access to the executive terminal networks after midnight. He was a ghost in the machine. And tonight, he had materialized. The risk was catastrophic, but standing in that shadows of that boardroom, listening to Arthur Pendleton deploy the exact same financial framing mechanism that had destroyed Elena, David had felt the cold, hard knot of grief in his chest ignite into a sudden, blinding clarity. He could not stand by and watch the monster claim another victim. Elena, her name was a physical sensation in his chest, a combination of profound warmth and jagged glass. 4 years ago, the memory played in his mind with the high-definition cruelty of trauma. The rain-slicked interstate, the twisted, smoking wreckage of the blue sedan crushed against the concrete median, the flashing red and blue lights painting the asphalt in chaotic strokes. The police report had been swift and sterile. Single vehicle accident, catastrophic brake failure caused by unseen road debris. But David knew better. Elena Brooks had not been the victim of bad luck. She had been an active field agent for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specializing in complex white-collar fraud. She had been 3 weeks away from presenting a federal grand jury with a mountain of evidence indicting Arthur Pendleton for a massive multi-state embezzlement scheme originating from his previous firm. The brakes on her car had not failed. They had been severed. He gripped the handle of the mop cart until his knuckles strained against the dark skin of his hands. The authorities had closed the case. The evidence Elena had gathered had mysteriously vanished from the digital archives. The system had protected its own, it always did. That was the grim, inescapable reality of the world. Power insulated power, wealth purchased immunity. The elevator shuddered to a halt in the sub-basement. The doors scraped open. David pushed the cart into the locker room. The air here smelled of damp concrete, old sweat, and pine cleaner. He stripped off the faded blue coveralls, folding them with precise, habitual care, placing them in the dented metal locker. He pulled on a pair of dark, worn denim jeans and a heavy gray wool sweater. He laced up his work boots. He retrieved his actual life from the top shelf of the locker, a battered leather messenger bag. Inside rested a customized, high-powered laptop heavily encrypted and loaded with data mining software, a stack of legal pads filled with his microscopic handwriting, and a small framed photograph. He pulled the photograph out, staring at it under the harsh fluorescent light. Elena smiled back at him. Her dark hair was blown across her face by a summer wind, her eyes bright with that fierce, unyielding intelligence that had drawn him to her on their very first day of accounting classes at the university. She was holding a tiny, bundled figure in her arms. "Lily, I got too close tonight." The words were a whisper, barely audible over the hum of the ventilation system. "He's going to look for the leak. He's going to investigate the staff." He returned the photograph to the bag. He slung the strap over his shoulder. He walked out of the service entrance into the unforgiving Manhattan night, pulling the collar of his sweater up against the driving rain. The subway ride to Brooklyn was a study in urban isolation. The train car was mostly empty, populated only by the exhausted ghosts of the late shift. A man in a stained chef's coat sleeping against the rattling glass. A nurse staring blankly at the floor. David sat perfectly still, his posture erect, his hands resting on the leather bag in his lap. He did not slump. He did not yield to the bone-deep fatigue. He was a certified forensic accountant, graduated top of his class. He had spent a decade building a lucrative consultancy, unraveling complex financial disputes for corporate clients. He had earned respect. He had earned a life of comfortable predictability. But the crash had shattered that reality into a million irrecoverable pieces. The grief had consumed him, rendering the polite, sterile world of corporate consulting utterly meaningless. When Lily's health had deteriorated, when the medical bills had begun to eclipse his savings, the pressure had become absolute. But he refused to surrender. He took the night job at Kensington Financial because it offered the keys to the kingdom. It offered access to Arthur Pendleton's physical proximity, his trash, his discarded notes, the unattended server terminals during the witching hour. He became a janitor to become a hunter. The train screeched to a halt at his station. He walked the 4 blocks to his apartment building through the freezing rain. The neighborhood was a transitional zone in Brooklyn, a mix of old industrial warehouses and crumbling brownstones fighting a losing battle against gentrification. His building was a squat brick structure that had seen better decades. He descended the concrete stairs to the basement unit. The heavy metal door groaned as he turned the deadbolt. He stepped inside, shaking the water from his coat. The apartment was small, the ceilings low, with exposed pipes running along the plaster, but it was fiercely clean. Not a single item was out of place. The worn furniture was arranged with geometric precision. A small bookshelf held rows of accounting texts, legal volumes, and a curated collection of children's literature. The dominant sound in the apartment was not the rain against the high, barred windows. It was the rhythmic, synthetic beep of a medical monitor. David walked softly into the tiny second bedroom. A nightlight shaped like a constellation cast a soft blue glow over the space. The walls were covered in crayon drawings, vibrant bursts of color against the drab paint. Drawings of trees, of sunshine, of a family standing together. In the narrow bed lay Lily, 7 years old. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, rapid breaths. Her skin was a beautiful deep brown, but tonight it carried an underlying ashiness that made David's chest tighten with a familiar, suffocating panic. A thin, translucent tube snaked from a small oxygen concentrator by the bed to her nose. A pulse oximeter clipped to her small index finger glowed with a steady red light, feeding data to the monitor on the nightstand. Congenital heart defect, tetralogy of Fallot, compounded by pulmonary atresia. The words were burned into his brain, a medical death sentence that hung over their lives every single day. She needed a complex, multi-stage reconstructive surgery. A surgery that cost more than most people earned in a decade. A surgery his standard health insurance had categorically denied as experimental, demanding out-of-pocket payment up front. He sat on the edge of the bed, his weight making the old springs creak softly. He reached out, his large, rough hand gently brushing a stray curl from her forehead. Her skin felt slightly too warm. The fear was a living thing in the room, a beast that paced the shadows waiting for him to lower his guard. He had calculated the numbers 1,000 times. If he sold everything, if he liquidated his minimal remaining retirement accounts, if he worked 20 hours a day, he was still hundreds of thousands of dollars short. The math was brutal and indifferent to a father's love. But he would not beg. He would not start a crowdfunding campaign to parade his daughter's suffering before the internet for pity. He had dignity. He deserved respect, and his daughter deserved privacy. He would find a way. He would tear the money from the corrupted systems of the world with his own 2 hands if he had to. Lily stirred. Her dark eyes blinked open, heavy with sleep. She looked up at him, her lips curving into a slow, gap-toothed smile that possessed the power to momentarily obliterate all the darkness in the world. "Daddy's home." Her voice was a soft, breathy whisper. "I'm right here, baby." David kept his voice low, steady, projecting an absolute, unshakable calm. "How's the chest tonight?" "A little tight." She coughed, a dry, rattling sound that made him wince internally. "Mrs. Higgins made soup, but I saved you some." Mrs. Higgins was the elderly woman upstairs who watched Lily during his night shifts, a lifeline in a city of strangers. "I appreciate that, little bird." He pulled the blanket up to her chin. "You go back to sleep. I'll be right here when the sun comes up." She reached out, her small fingers wrapping around his large thumb. "Were you fighting bad guys tonight, Daddy?" The question caught him off guard. She asked it with the profound, penetrating wisdom that children subjected to chronic illness often possess. They see the underlying truth of adult actions, stripping away the complex rationalizations. David looked down at her small hand. He thought of the $47 million. He thought of Arthur Pendleton's pale, cruel eyes. He thought of Elena's crushed car. "Yes, baby." The words carried the weight of a vow. "I was fighting bad guys." She smiled again, her eyes fluttering shut. "Good, because you're the bravest." He sat there until her breathing deepened into the rhythm of true sleep. He carefully extracted his thumb from her grip. He stood up, the fatigue hitting him with the force of a physical blow, but he did not move toward his own bed. He walked out to the small living area. He pulled the heavy, dark curtain that covered the far wall. Behind the fabric lay a massive corkboard dominating the space. It was a chaotic masterpiece of forensic investigation. Hundreds of printed documents, wire transfer receipts, incorporation papers, and photographs were pinned to the cork. Thick strands of red yarn connected the disparate pieces of data, forming a complex web that mapped the entire financial architecture of Arthur Pendleton's life. David pulled the laptop from his bag and set it on the small kitchen table. He powered it up, the screen casting a harsh, clinical light across his exhausted features. He pulled up the encrypted file he had transferred from the USB drive he carried in the heel of his boot. The raw server log data from the boardroom. He began to type. His fingers moved across the keyboard with blinding speed, a stark contrast to the slow, deliberate movements of the janitor he had portrayed hours earlier. He ran the data through a proprietary sorting algorithm he had coded himself. He was looking for the ghost in the machine. He was looking for the exact mechanism Arthur had used to forge Claire Kensington's digital credentials. The sun began to rise over Brooklyn, casting thin shafts of gray light through the barred windows, but David did not stop. He drank cold, bitter coffee from a chipped mug. He cross-referenced IP addresses. He traced routing protocols through servers in Dublin, Singapore, and the Caymans. He dismantled the $47 million theft line by line, exposing the architecture of the fraud. It was brilliant work. Arthur was a master of financial obfuscation. But Arthur had never anticipated a forensic accountant operating with the absolute terrifying focus of a grieving husband. By 7 in the morning, David had cracked the primary authentication layer. He found the backdoor Arthur had installed in the executive network during a system update 3 years prior. It was the smoking gun. It proved that Arthur had the capability to mimic the CEO's digital signature perfectly. He saved the file to 3 separate encrypted drives. He closed the laptop. He rubbed his face with both hands, the rough sound of calloused skin against a night's growth of beard filling the quiet room. The beep of the heart monitor changed tempo slightly as Lily woke up. David stood, pushing the exhaustion deep down into a locked compartment in his mind. He closed the curtain over the wall of evidence. The forensic accountant vanished. The father took over. He walked into the kitchen space. He pulled a carton of eggs and a small block of cheddar cheese from the ancient refrigerator. He began to cook. The smell of scrambling eggs and melting butter slowly filled the apartment, masking the faint, persistent odor of damp brick and old pipes. Lily emerged from her room a few minutes later. She moved slowly, her energy reserves depleted before the day had even begun. She dragged her small, wheeled oxygen tank behind her, the plastic tubing trailing across the worn linoleum floor. She wore faded pink pajamas and clutched a worn, stuffed bear. David pulled out one of the mismatched kitchen chairs for her. He set a warm plate of eggs and toast in front of her. He poured a small glass of orange juice. "Eat up, little bird." He sat across from her with his own plate. "We have an appointment with Dr. Aris this afternoon to check those numbers." Lily poked at her eggs with a fork. "I don't like the hospital. It smells like bleach and sad people." "I know, baby." "Oh." He kept his tone light, encouraging. "But we have to make sure the engine is running right. You're my favorite machine." They ate in a comfortable domestic silence. It was a quiet intimacy, a profound connection forged in the crucible of loss and shared struggle. They were a team of two against a world that seemed largely indifferent to their existence. David watched her eat, cataloging every detail. The slight blue tint around her lips that indicated low oxygen saturation, the way her shoulders hunched slightly, compensating for the effort of breathing, the fierce, determined spark in her eyes that was pure Elena. The stack of mail sat on the edge of the table. He didn't need to open the envelopes to know what they contained. Final notices, collection warnings, the staggering, insurmountable cost of keeping his daughter alive. The temptation was always there, whispering in the dark hours. The temptation to compromise, to use his skills for the shadow economy, to launder money for the syndicates operating out of the ports. They paid in cash, millions of dollars, no questions asked. He pushed the thought away with violent mental force. He had dignity. He deserved respect. He would not defile the memory of his wife by becoming the very thing she had died fighting. Intent didn't erase impact. If he crossed that line, he would lose himself. And if he lost himself, he would have nothing left to give his daughter. He would fight this battle with his mind, with his unyielding competence, and with his character intact. At 9:30 that morning, miles away across the East River, The reality of corporate warfare was unfolding with brutal efficiency. Claire Kensington stood in the gleaming, marble-floored lobby of Kensington Financial. The morning rush of executives and analysts flowed around her, a river of bespoke suits and designer briefcases. For the first time in 10 years, she was an island in that river. She held her gold-trimmed executive keycard against the optical scanner of the private elevator bank. The scanner pulsed red. A sharp electronic beep indicated denial of access. She tried again. The result was the same. Two men in dark suits wearing the discreet earpieces of corporate security stepped out from the shadow of the structural pillars. They approached her with professional, emotionless strides. "Ms. Kensington," the lead guard spoke with rehearsed neutrality, "we have instructions to escort you to a secondary conference room on the ground floor. The board requires your presence." Claire stared at the red light of the scanner. The physical reality of the lockout was a shock to the system, a visceral confirmation of Arthur's victory. They hadn't even waited for the formal board vote. Arthur had already moved. He had weaponized the missing $47 million, convincing the executive committee that she was a flight risk, an active threat to the firm's solvency. She squared her shoulders. She did not argue. She did not display a fraction of the rage boiling in her blood. She turned and walked toward the secondary conference room, flanked by the guards like a prisoner of war. The meeting lasted less than 15 minutes. The chairman of the board, an 80-year-old patriarch who had vacationed with her grandfather, delivered the verdict without looking her in the eye. Pending a full forensic audit and a federal investigation, her employment was terminated with cause. Her access to all company assets, physical and digital, was immediately revoked. She was ordered to surrender her phone and her laptop. She walked out of the building onto the rain-slicked pavement of Wall Street, stripped of everything that defined her identity. No company, no title, no power. The armor she had worn for a decade had been systematically dismantled, leaving her exposed to the cold, unforgiving air of the city. She walked for blocks without a destination. The chaotic noise of Manhattan washed over her. The blaring horns, the screech of brakes, the shouts of couriers. She found herself in a small, overpriced coffee shop near Battery Park. She sat in a corner booth, staring at a paper cup of black coffee she had no intention of drinking. Her mind, usually a precision instrument of strategic calculation, felt fractured. Arthur had executed a perfect framing. He had controlled the narrative, controlled the evidence, and manipulated the board. But there was a variable he had not controlled: the janitor. Claire closed her eyes, replaying the scene in the boardroom. The tall black man in the faded coveralls, the way he had moved, completely unafraid, the document he had dropped on the table, the specific, highly technical forensic terminology he had used. Proxy routing number, origin IP timestamp, secondary ledger. That was not the vocabulary of a maintenance worker. That was the language of an elite financial operative. Who was he? Why had he intervened? Why had he possessed access to server logs that her own cybersecurity team couldn't locate? Claire reached into her designer trench coat. She had surrendered her company phone, but she was not a fool. She carried a secondary unregistered device, a burner smartphone she used exclusively for communicating with a private intelligence firm she occasionally retained for corporate espionage. She powered on the device. She navigated to a secure, encrypted portal she had secretly established years ago, a backdoor into the company's human resources database. It was a failsafe she had built precisely because she trusted no one, not even Arthur. She searched the maintenance staff roster. She filtered for the night shift on the 42nd floor. The profile appeared on the small screen. David Brooks, age 39, employed for exactly 3 months. She opened his background file. It was a masterpiece of generic documentation, a standard high school diploma from a public school in Queens. A decade of varied, unremarkable employment history in warehouse logistics and commercial cleaning. No criminal record, no debt, no outstanding tax liens. It was too clean. It was the digital equivalent of a freshly bleached floor. It possessed the sterile perfection of a manufactured identity. Nobody living in New York City for 39 years had a digital footprint that shallow. She memorized the address listed on the file, an apartment in a deteriorating section of Brooklyn. Claire stood up, abandoning the cold coffee. She walked out into the damp gray morning. She raised a hand, hailing a yellow cab. "Brooklyn," she told the driver, giving him the cross streets. The ride took 45 minutes, carrying her across the bridge, away from the glass and steel canyons of wealth and into a borough defined by brick concrete and the relentless grind of the working class. The cab pulled to the curb on a street lined with struggling bodegas and aging brownstones. Claire stepped out. Her Manolo Blahnik heels clicked sharply against the cracked pavement, a sound completely alien to the environment. She pulled her trench coat tighter against the wind. She looked at the building, verifying the address painted in fading black numerals above the door. She descended the concrete steps to the basement level. The area was impeccably swept, the small patch of concrete free of the trash that littered the street above. A single healthy fern sat in a terracotta pot near the heavy metal door. She hesitated. For a decade, she had controlled every interaction in her life. She summoned people to her office. She dictated the terms of engagement. Standing here in the damp stairwell of a Brooklyn basement, she was entirely out of her element. She was vulnerable. She raised a hand and knocked firmly on the metal door. The sound echoed hollowly. She waited. The silence stretched. She considered turning around, considered the absurdity of a CEO seeking salvation from a janitor. The deadbolt threw with a heavy metallic clack. The door opened inward. Claire braced herself, expecting the imposing, unsmiling man from the boardroom. Instead, she looked down. A young girl stood in the doorway. She was small for her age, wearing faded pink pajamas and clutching a stuffed bear. A thin, translucent tube ran beneath her nose, connected to a portable oxygen tank resting on the floor beside her. Her dark eyes, large and startlingly perceptive, analyzed Claire with an intensity that felt unnervingly adult. Claire stared at the medical equipment, thrown entirely off balance. The Ice Queen CEO, capable of destroying a competitor with a single phone call, found herself momentarily stripped of words by the fragile reality of a sick child. "Hello," Claire managed, her voice lacking its usual commanding edge. "I'm looking for David Brooks." The girl did not move aside. She maintained her position in the doorway, a fierce, tiny guardian of the threshold. She looked Claire up and down, taking in the expensive coat, the immaculate hair, the tense, guarded posture. The girl turned her head slightly, calling back into the depths of the apartment. "Daddy." Lily's voice was soft, but it carried the unmistakable weight of a profound, unvarnished observation. "There's a lady at the door. Why doesn't she know how to smile?" Words count, 3,505. Self-correction. I am far short of the minimum 5,500 word constraint. The narrative density must increase significantly. I will seamlessly continue the scene, expanding the micro-actions, the psychological tension, and the environmental details, pushing deeper into the immediate aftermath of this collision of worlds without advancing to Act Two's specific plot points yet. I must stay within the bounds of Part 1's outline. The brutal honesty of the child's question hung in the damp air of the stairwell, stripping away the last remnants of Claire's carefully constructed corporate armor. It was not a malicious question, but an observational truth delivered with the uncompromising clarity only children possess. Claire felt a sudden sharp tightness in her chest, a phantom echo of the humanity she had systematically buried years ago. She tried to formulate a response, to summon a polite, neutralizing corporate pleasantry, but the muscles in her face refused to cooperate. The child was right. She had forgotten the physical mechanics of a genuine smile. Heavy, measured footsteps sounded from within the apartment. The shadows shifted and David Brooks materialized in the narrow hallway behind his daughter. He wore the same dark denim and gray wool sweater from the night before, his physical presence commanding the small space with an effortless, unyielding gravity. He placed a large, calloused hand gently on Lily's shoulder, a gesture that immediately communicated absolute protection and profound tenderness. David did not look surprised to see the ousted CEO of Kensington Financial standing on his cracked concrete welcome mat. His dark eyes registered her presence with the same calm, analytical focus he applied to corrupted financial ledgers. He saw the tension in her posture, the slight dampness of her expensive coat, the barely suppressed desperation vibrating beneath her skin. "Go sit by the monitor, little bird," David said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that vibrated in the narrow hallway. "It's time for your reading." Lily looked up at him, then back at Claire, offering a final, assessing glance before turning away. She dragged her oxygen tank with slow, practiced movements, retreating into the deeper shadows of the apartment. David stepped fully into the doorway, filling the frame entirely. He did not invite Claire inside. He did not offer a greeting. He simply waited, an immovable object forcing her to initiate the confrontation. "Your employment file is a fabrication." Claire spoke rapidly, aiming for authority, but hearing the slight, betraying tremor in her own voice. 3 months as a commercial cleaner. Before that, warehouse logistics. It's a beautifully constructed fiction, Mr. Brooks. Or whatever your real name is. No janitor understands the architecture of Cayman proxy routing. No janitor possesses the server access to isolate secondary ledger decimals. "My name is David Brooks." He did not shift his stance. He did not raise his voice. He met her gaze with a level of directness she found entirely unsettling. The men in her world averted their eyes when challenged. This man held his ground as if he owned the earth beneath his boots. "The file is accurate. I mop floors, I empty trash. You intervened." She stepped closer, the physical proximity failing to diminish his imposing presence. "You risked your fabricated identity to drop that document on the table. You knew exactly what Arthur was doing. You knew he was framing me for the 47 million. Why?" David looked past her, studying the gray, rain-washed street above the stairwell. The memories of Elena, the crushing weight of the injustice that had brought him to this exact moment, pulsed beneath his calm exterior. He had planned to remain invisible. He had planned to gather the evidence, compile the dossier, and deliver it directly to the federal authorities when the trap was perfectly set. But Arthur's move against Claire had mirrored the past too closely. He had watched the jaws of the machine closing around another target, and he had reacted not as a strategic operative, but as a man who could not abide the destruction of the innocent. "I don't like bullies." The words were simple, profound, carrying the weight of a core operating philosophy. And Arthur Pendleton is a bully who hides behind complex algorithms and offshore accounts. "He didn't just bully me." Claire's voice cracked, the reality of her total defeat finally breaking through the surface. "He destroyed me. The board terminated my contract an hour ago. My accounts are frozen. My legacy, my grandfather's company, is in the hands of a man who engineered a massive fraud. I have nothing left." She expected him to offer sympathy, to react to the magnitude of her fall. But David Brooks merely absorbed the information, his expression remaining completely unreadable. "You have your freedom." He stated the fact with cold precision. "He offered you an exit. You walk away with nothing, but you don't go to prison. That is a generous offer from a man like Arthur." "I am not walking away." The ice returned to her voice, sharpened by a sudden, desperate fury. "I am going to tear him down. I am going to expose every rotten timber in that company, but I can't do it alone. The forensic data you showed me last night, it's the key. You have access. You understand the architecture he built. I need you to help me prove he forged my digital credentials." David looked at her, his eyes narrowing slightly. He saw a woman driven by ego, by the loss of status, by the terrifying prospect of irrelevance. She was not fighting for justice. She was fighting for her throne. "No!" The single syllable hit her like a physical blow. She blinked, unaccustomed to the word. I can pay you. When I recover my assets, when I prove my innocence, I can compensate you beyond anything you make pushing a cart. Name your price. David's jaw tightened. The offer of money delivered with the casual arrogance of wealth struck the deepest, most sensitive nerve in his psyche. He thought of the stack of medical bills on his kitchen counter. He thought of the impossible cost of Lily's surgery. The temptation flared again, a brief, violent spark in the dark, but he extinguished it instantly. I have dignity. The words were quiet, immovable, striking the damp air with the force of an anvil. I deserve respect. My skills are not for sale to the highest bidder, and my integrity is not a commodity you can purchase to settle a corporate vendetta. Claire recoiled slightly, the absolute moral clarity of his statement piercing her defensive armor. She realized with a sudden sinking dread that she had fundamentally misread the man standing before her. He was not a mercenary. He was not an opportunist waiting for a payday. He operated on a frequency of honor she had entirely forgotten existed. Please. The word felt foreign on her tongue. It tasted like ash. If Arthur finalizes this takeover, if he buries the subledgers, the truth disappears permanently. He wins. He takes everything. David studied her face. He saw the desperation, the raw, unfiltered terror of a woman realizing that the rules of her universe had suddenly been rewritten. He understood the mathematics of power better than she did. He knew that Arthur Pendleton would not stop with her termination. Arthur would ensure she was entirely neutralized. He would fabricate additional evidence. He would leverage the legal system to ensure she never posed a threat again. And if Arthur succeeded in burying the current fraud, the evidence David had spent 4 years gathering regarding Elena's death might be permanently corrupted. Their paths were inextricably linked, bound by the gravity of the same monster. From inside the apartment, the medical monitor emitted a sharp, rhythmic warning beep. David's head snapped around, his entire demeanor shifting from immovable stoicism to immediate, terrifying focus. He turned his back on Claire without a word, vanishing into the shadows of the hallway. Claire stood frozen on the threshold. The unwritten rules of her society dictated that she should leave, that she should not intrude on a crisis that did not concern her. But the sheer force of her desperation, combined with a sudden, inexplicable concern for the child with the oxygen tank, propelled her forward. She stepped across the welcome mat, entering the dimly lit apartment. The air smelled of old paper, strong coffee, and the faint, sterile scent of rubbing alcohol. She moved down the narrow hallway, drawn toward the source of the mechanical alarm. She stopped in the doorway of the small bedroom. David was crouched beside the bed, his large hands working with practiced, frantic speed. He was adjusting the flow valve on the oxygen concentrator, his eyes locked on the digital readout of the pulse oximeter clipped to Lily's finger. The numbers were flashing red, oxygen saturation dropping. Lily was propped up against the pillows, her small chest heaving as she fought for air. Her eyes were wide, filled with a panic that tore at the fundamental architecture of David's soul. Breathe with me, little bird. David's voice was a steady, rhythmic chant, projecting a calm he did not feel. In through the nose. Hold it. Out through the mouth. You know the drill. You are the strongest machine. He placed one hand flat against her chest, feeling the erratic, struggling rhythm of her damaged heart. He synchronized his own breathing with hers, forcing his massive lungs to expand and contract in a slow, deliberate cadence, trying to guide her back from the edge. Claire watched from the doorway, entirely forgotten. The scene unfolding before her was so intensely intimate, so raw and terrifying that it made her own corporate disaster feel suddenly, profoundly insignificant. She watched the man who had effortlessly decoded a $47 million fraud, a man who possessed the immovable dignity of a king, brought to his knees by the fragile mechanics of a child's failing heart. She saw the stack of final medical notices sitting on the edge of the nightstand. She saw the worn, mismatched furniture. She saw the absolute, uncompromising love radiating from the father to the daughter. It was a revelation that shattered the ice she had cultivated for a decade. She realized in that moment that she understood absolutely nothing about true power, about true stakes, about the catastrophic cost of survival in a world that did not care if you lived or died. The numbers on the monitor slowly stopped flashing. The red light shifted to a steady green. Lily's breathing slowed, losing the desperate, ragged edge. She leaned her head against David's large hand, her eyes fluttering shut as exhaustion claimed her. David stayed crouched beside the bed for a long time, his hand resting on her chest, his head bowed. He looked like a man who had just finished a brutal, physical battle. He finally stood up, his movements stiff. He turned and saw Claire standing in the doorway. He did not look angry. He simply looked exhausted, the weight of his dual existence pressing down on him with crushing force. He walked past her, gesturing for her to follow him into the small living area. He pulled the heavy, dark curtain back, exposing the massive corkboard. Claire gasped. The wall was a sprawling, chaotic map of corporate malfeasance. She saw photographs of Arthur. She saw wire transfer receipts dating back a decade. She saw the names of defunct shell companies, routing numbers, and deeply buried holding structures. It was a visual representation of a relentless, obsessive hunt. He didn't just steal the money. David's voice was hollow, stripped of all emotion. He pointed to a photograph pinned to the center of the board, a woman with dark hair and fierce, intelligent eyes. 4 years ago, my wife, Elena, was an FBI agent building a federal indictment against Arthur for embezzlement. 3 weeks before she was scheduled to testify, the brakes on her car failed on the interstate. Claire stared at the photograph, the reality of the horror settling into her bones like winter frost. The boardroom politics, the missing millions, the frozen accounts. It all paled in comparison to the cold-blooded murder of a federal agent. She looked at David, finally understanding the depth of the ocean he was navigating. He wasn't a janitor looking for a payout. He was a widower seeking justice against an untouchable system. I have spent 4 years tracing his ghost. David ran a hand over his face. I have the financial data, I have the routing sequences, but I don't have the final authorization key. The secondary server requires biometric authentication. I can't break that without triggering a system-wide lockdown. Claire looked at the board, then looked at the man who had built it. The walls she had constructed to protect herself were completely gone, replaced by a sudden, terrifying vulnerability. She was no longer the CEO. She was just a woman standing in a basement looking at a man who understood the true cost of courage. My security clearance. The words slipped out, carrying the weight of a final, irrevocable decision. They revoked my digital access, but they haven't scrubbed my biometric profile from the physical security servers in the sub-basement. It takes 48 hours for the protocol to clear the physical locks. David turned to her, the analytical fire igniting in his dark eyes once again. If we access the physical server room, I can hardwire into the primary node. I can pull the unfiltered authentication logs. I can prove he forged your signature, and I can prove he funded the offshore account that paid the mechanic who cut Elena's brakes. It was an alliance forged in the absolute darkest moment of their lives. A partnership between an exiled queen and an invisible king. We go tonight. Claire's voice was steady, the tremor entirely gone. Before the board ratifies my termination. Before Arthur realizes the janitor knows his name. David looked at the closed door of his daughter's bedroom. He thought of the terrifying drop in her oxygen levels. He thought of the risk, the catastrophic consequences if they were caught. It would mean prison. It would mean leaving Lily alone. But doing nothing meant letting the monster win. It meant accepting a world where power justified murder. I can rebuild a company, Claire said softly, reading the conflict in his eyes. Not a family. We do this, we do it right. No mistakes. David met her gaze. The alliance was sealed without a handshake. bound by a shared desperation and a mutual demand for a truth that the world refused to acknowledge. The battle lines were drawn. The harsh, unforgiving glare of the laptop screen illuminated the cramped Brooklyn kitchen, casting long, distorted shadows across the peeling floral wallpaper. Mismatched dining chairs scraped against the uneven linoleum as David navigated the labyrinthine architecture of Kensington Financial's deeply buried offshore accounts. Stacks of printed ledger data covered in his microscopic red ink annotations formed unstable towers around half-empty mugs of bitter, hours-old coffee. Claire sat across the scarred wooden table, her expensive charcoal suit jacket discarded over the back of a chair, the silk sleeves of her blouse rolled up to her elbows. The physical reality of her exile was settling into her bones, an icy dread that threatened to paralyze her cognitive functions. She watched the man across from her work. His fingers flew across the keyboard with a terrifying rhythmic precision. He did not pause to consult manuals or reference sheets. He possessed an innate, architectural understanding of corrupted data. He was currently dismantling a cascading series of dummy corporations registered in Delaware, peeling back the layers of obfuscation Arthur Pendleton had constructed over 3 decades. The primary routing node isn't in the Caymans. David's dark eyes remained locked on the scrolling lines of code. It's a mirror, a digital decoy designed to trigger exactly the kind of automated compliance red flags that would point the federal investigators directly at your personal holding company. Claire leaned forward, her elbows resting on the scattered papers, attempting to decipher the raw data cascading down the monitor. For 10 years, she had commanded an army of Ivy League-educated financial analysts, paying them exorbitant salaries to interpret market fluctuations and audit internal compliance. None of them possessed a fraction of the raw, unadulterated genius currently radiating from the man who had mopped her boardroom floor 24 hours earlier. "Show me the origin point." Her voice carried a raspy edge, stripped of its usual boardroom command. David executed a complex command string, bringing up a split-screen display. The left side showed the $47 million transfer authorized by Claire's forged digital signature. The right side displayed a deeply buried, seemingly innocuous vendor payment log from a defunct subsidiary Arthur had quietly liquidated 3 years prior. He fragmented the total amount. David tapped the screen, indicating a sequence of microtransactions. He ran it through an automated payroll ghosting program. The money didn't move in a single block. It bled out over 18 months, disguised as severances, consulting fees, and independent contractor retainers for a subsidiary that no longer legally existed. The Caymans account was just the final, localized aggregation point. The sheer elegance of the fraud sent a chill down Claire's spine. Arthur had weaponized the very bureaucratic inefficiencies she had spent her tenure trying to eliminate. He had used the company's massive administrative blind spots against her. "My authentication key." Claire traced the edge of a coffee mug with a trembling finger. How did he bypass the biometric dual-factor protocol? The system requires a physical thumbprint scan for any transfer exceeding $5 million. He didn't bypass it. David pulled up a separate, heavily encrypted file. He cloned it. During the system-wide server migration 2 years ago, Arthur authorized a third-party cybersecurity firm to run penetration testing on the executive nodes. The firm was a front. He used the access to scrape your biometric hash data directly from the physical security servers in the sub-basement. He possesses a digital replica of your physical identity. The violation felt visceral, a cold hand reaching into her chest. Her identity, the very core of her authority, had been stolen and weaponized while she sat in strategy meetings praising Arthur's fiscal conservatism. "We have the data." Claire looked at the corkboard in the living room, the sprawling map of Arthur's sins. "We take this to the Securities and Exchange Commission. We go to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. This proves the transfers were a synthetic construct. It proves a synthetic construct exists." David leaned back, the ancient wooden chair groaning under his weight. "It does not prove Arthur constructed it, A defense attorney will argue that you orchestrated the entire ghost payroll scheme yourself to hide the theft, and that this data is merely evidence of your own sophisticated criminality. Then what do we need? We need the Genesis block. David rubbed his temples, the exhaustion carving deep lines around his mouth. We need the specific time-stamped server log that shows Arthur's personal terminal establishing the connection to the ghosting program. He scrubbed the primary network, but the physical backup servers in the sub-basement run on an isolated air-gapped power grid. They record physical hardware access. If he plugged a drive into the mainframe to upload your cloned biometric data, the physical server logged his unique hardware MAC address. The magnitude of the task settled heavily over the small kitchen. Accessing the air-gapped servers required physical entry to the most heavily fortified room in the Kensington Financial Building. The low, persistent hiss of the oxygen concentrator in the adjoining bedroom shifted its rhythm slightly. David instantly turned his head, his entire posture tightening. The forensic analyst vanished, replaced entirely by the father. He pushed away from the table, the chair scraping loudly against the linoleum. Claire watched him move down the narrow hallway. The sheer totality of his devotion was something she could not comprehend. She had been raised in a sprawling Connecticut estate, surrounded by nannies, tutors, and boarding school administrators. Her father had shown affection through trust funds and aggressive stock portfolio transfers. Love, in the Kensington vocabulary, was a commodity to be leveraged, a transaction requiring a measurable return on investment. She stood up, her joints popping in protest after hours of rigid focus. She walked quietly down the hallway, stopping just short of the bedroom door. Lily was sitting up in the narrow bed, the thin plastic tubing secured beneath her nose. She held a worn box of crayons, meticulously applying a bright, aggressive yellow to a piece of construction paper resting on a hardcover book. "The yellow is almost gone, Daddy." Lily did not look up from her work. "We'll get a new box tomorrow, little bird." David sat on the edge of the mattress, checking the pulse oximeter clipped to her finger. The red numbers held steady. "You're working hard on that one. It has to be right." Lily pressed the crayon down with fierce concentration. Claire stepped slightly further into the doorway, her presence casting a long shadow across the worn carpet. Lily stopped coloring. She looked up, her dark, perceptive eyes locking onto the exiled executive. "You're still here." Lily tilted her head, analyzing Claire with the unvarnished scrutiny of a 7-year-old. "Mrs. Higgins usually goes home when Daddy wakes up." "I'm not Mrs. Higgins." Claire attempted a reassuring tone, but the words sounded hollow, stripped of their usual corporate polish. "I know." Lily set the yellow crayon down. "You're the lady who doesn't smile. Are you hiding from the bad guys too?" The directness of the question stripped the oxygen from Claire's lungs. She looked at David, expecting him to intervene to offer a polite parental deflection. David merely watched her, his expression neutral, offering no rescue. He allowed the child's question to hang in the air, demanding an honest answer. "Yes." Claire looked back at the little girl, abandoning the pretense of invulnerability. "I am hiding from a very bad man." Lily considered this information carefully. She picked up a bright purple crayon. "Daddy fights bad guys. He's the bravest. You don't have to be scared if Daddy is helping you." The absolute, unshakable faith in the child's voice triggered a profound ache in Claire's chest. She had commanded thousands of employees, dictated market trends, and generated billions in revenue. Yet she had never inspired that level of pure, unadulterated trust in another human being. "I am very lucky he is helping me." Claire's voice softened, a genuine fraction of warmth bleeding through the glacial exterior. "You look hungry." Lily turned back to her drawing. "Daddy makes the best chicken, even better than the diner on the corner." The mention of food triggered a sudden, hollow realization in Claire's stomach. She hadn't eaten since a catered breakfast meeting 36 hours ago. The corporate adrenaline had masked the physical deficit, but the quiet domesticity of the Brooklyn apartment was dismantling her biological overrides. David stood up, giving his daughter's blanket a gentle tug. "The lady is right. The engine needs fuel, both engines." He walked past Claire, his shoulder briefly brushing hers in the narrow hallway. The physical contact was fleeting, but it carried a grounding, solid weight. The kitchen transitioned from a forensic war room to a domestic sanctuary with startling speed. David stacked the encrypted documents, clearing a space on the scarred wooden table. He pulled a whole chicken from the ancient refrigerator, moving with a practiced rhythmic efficiency. Claire stood near the sink, entirely unsure of her role in this environment. In her penthouse, meals were orchestrated by a private chef, appearing on pristine white porcelain and vanishing just as quietly. The concept of participating in the chaotic sensory experience of cooking was entirely alien. "Grab those potatoes." David pointed to a mesh bag resting on the counter with the tip of a chef's knife. "Wash them, don't peel them, just scrub the dirt off." Claire hesitated for a fraction of a second. She was the chief executive officer of a global financial institution. She did not scrub root vegetables. David paused, the knife hovering over a cutting board. He looked at her, his dark eyes reading the internal conflict playing out across her features. "In this house, everyone works." His voice was low, carrying no malice, only the immovable expectation of shared burden. "The title stays at the door." Claire stepped forward. She turned on the faucet, the water sputtering before flowing in a steady, lukewarm stream. She picked up a potato, the rough, earthy skin scraping against her manicured fingers. She began to scrub, the simple, repetitive physical action grounding her chaotic thoughts. The apartment filled with the rich, heavy scent of roasting chicken, garlic, and rosemary. It was the smell of home, of warmth, of an emotional security Claire had never experienced. Her childhood had smelled of lemon polish, expensive perfume, and the crisp, sterile scent of freshly printed financial prospectuses. David chopped onions with a blinding, rhythmic speed, the knife blade blurring against the wood. "You lived in a glass house for 10 years. You trusted the walls because you paid for them. I trusted the people who built the walls." Claire kept her eyes on the sink, watching the dirt wash down the drain. "Arthur was my father's closest confidant. He taught me how to read a balance sheet when I was 12. He attended my college graduation when my father was too busy finalizing a merger in Tokyo. Predators don't wear signs." David scraped the chopped onions into a hot cast-iron skillet, the sudden sizzle filling the room. "They build trust. They become indispensable. They learn the architecture of your life so they know exactly where to place the explosives." "How did you survive it?" Claire placed the clean potatoes on the counter, turning to look at his broad back. "When you found out about Elena, when the system closed the investigation and walked away, how did you not just let the anger burn you to the ground?" David stopped moving. The sizzle of the onions seemed to amplify in the sudden stillness of the kitchen. He gripped the edge of the counter, his knuckles tightening, the muscles in his forearms pulling taut. "I burned." His voice was a ragged whisper dragged over broken glass. "For 6 months I was nothing but ash. I stopped sleeping. I stopped eating. I sat in a dark room and planned 100 different ways to kill Arthur Pendleton with my bare hands." He turned around. The raw, unfiltered grief etched into his face forced Claire to take a small step back. But then the medical bills started arriving. David looked toward the hallway, toward the rhythmic hiss of the oxygen machine. Lily's heart started failing, and I realized that if I let the fire consume me, my daughter would burn with me. I had to build a new architecture. I had to weaponize my patience. I took the night shifts. I started tracking the offshore accounts. I built the board in the living room. You sacrificed your career." Claire looked at the cramped apartment, the stark reality of his economic struggle pressing in on all sides. "You gave up your life. I preserved my dignity." The absolute certainty in his eyes was blinding. I refuse to live in a world where my wife's murder was written off as a bureaucratic inconvenience. My daughter needs a father who can look her in the eye, not a ghost consumed by vengeance. I am going to tear Arthur down using the very system he corrupted, and I am going to do it in the light of day. The dinner was a quiet, profound affair. They ate off mismatched ceramic plates, the heavy wooden table cleared of the financial ruin of Kensington Financial. Lily sat between them, the plastic tubing trailing from her nose, eating small, careful bites of the roasted chicken. Claire watched the interaction between father and daughter. It was an intricate dance of silent communication, of deep, unshakable bonds. David anticipated Lily's needs before she voiced them, pouring her water, cutting a piece of potato into a smaller, manageable size. "You have to eat the carrots, little bird." David tapped her plate with his fork. "Fuel for the engine. Carrots are orange." Lily wrinkled her nose with profound distaste. "Orange is a loud color. Orange makes your eyes sharp so you can see the bad guys in the dark." David offered a small, reassuring smile. Lily sighed with heavy, dramatic resignation, carefully piercing a small piece of carrot with her fork. She looked across the table at Claire, who was slowly dissecting her own meal. "Do you like orange?" Lily asked, the question demanding a serious response. "I prefer gray." Claire looked down at her charcoal suit jacket draped over the chair. "Gray is safe. It blends in." Lily considered this. "Gray is sad, like the rain." The observation struck a deep chord within Claire. She had built an entire existence out of gray. Gray suits, gray boardrooms, the gray morality of corporate acquisitions. She had blended in so perfectly that she had completely lost the vibrant, messy colors of a human life. After dinner, the relentless fatigue of her ordeal finally caught up with Claire. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the board meeting, the expulsion, and the frantic forensic analysis crashed heavily. She sat on the worn fabric sofa in the living room, staring blankly at the sprawling corkboard of evidence, the connections blurring into a meaningless web of red yarn. David was in the kitchen, washing the dishes with the same methodical precision he applied to tracking stolen millions. The sound of running water and clinking ceramic was a soothing, domestic rhythm. Small, shuffling footsteps approached the sofa. Claire turned her head. Lily stood beside the armrest, clutching a dog-eared, heavily taped children's book to her chest. The oxygen tank rested on the floor beside her small, slippered feet. "Daddy has to finish the dishes." Lily held the book out, an offering and a command. "It's time for the story." Claire stared at the brightly colored cover depicting a whimsical cartoon bear. Panic, sharp and unfamiliar, spiked in her chest. She negotiated billion-dollar mergers. She dismantled hostile takeover bids. She did not read stories to children. "Lily, I'm not sure I'm the best person for this." Claire's voice was tight, defensive. "I don't really know how." "You just look at the words and say them out loud." Lily's logic was unassailable. She climbed onto the sofa, carefully maneuvering her tubing, and settled herself next to Claire. She dropped the book onto Claire's lap. Claire looked at the kitchen doorway, silently pleading for rescue. But David remained at the sink, his back turned, allowing the moment to unfold without intervention. She opened the book. The binding cracked softly. The pages were worn smooth from hundreds of readings. She cleared her throat, feeling utterly ridiculous, and began to read. Her voice was stiff at first, carrying the clipped, precise cadence of an executive summary. She delivered the dialogue of the cartoon bear with the same inflection she used to announce quarterly losses. But Lily leaned closer, her small, warm weight pressing against Claire's side. The child's breathing was a soft, rhythmic whistle. Slowly, imperceptibly, the ice began to fracture. Claire felt the warmth of the small body beside her. She felt the absolute, unconditional trust inherent in the simple act of sharing a story. The corporate armor she had worn for a decade felt suddenly heavy, suffocating, and entirely unnecessary. She slowed her pace. She allowed the inflection of the words to change, finding a softer, gentler rhythm. She read about a bear searching for honey in a dark forest, and for the first time in 10 years, she wasn't thinking about market capitalization or hostile acquisitions. She was simply existing in a quiet room with a child who possessed a failing heart and a profound, luminous spirit. By the time she reached the final page, Lily's eyes were drooping, the heavy weight of sleep pulling her down. Claire closed the book softly. She looked down at the little girl leaning against her arm. A strange, terrifying emotion swelled in her chest, a mixture of profound sorrow and desperate, protective warmth. Lily shifted slightly, reaching into the pocket of her pink pajamas. She pulled out a folded piece of construction paper. She pressed it into Claire's hand. "I finished the yellow." Lily's voice was a sleepy murmur. Claire unfolded the paper. It was a drawing executed with aggressive, vibrant crayon strokes. It depicted 3 figures standing outside a tall, gray building. A large man in a blue sweater, a small girl with a tube on her face, and a woman. The woman was wearing a bright, blindingly yellow dress, and she possessed a massive, curved smile. Claire stared at the drawing, her vision suddenly blurring. The edges of the paper trembled in her hands. She had spent millions on art consultants purchasing abstract pieces to decorate her sterile penthouse, but nothing had ever struck her with the devastating emotional force of this simple crayon drawing. David appeared silently beside the sofa. He reached down, scooping Lily up with effortless strength, carefully managing the trailing oxygen tube. "Time for the charging station, little bird," he murmured, pressing a kiss to her forehead. Lily mumbled incoherently, her head falling against his broad shoulder. David carried her down the hall, disappearing into the bedroom. Claire remained on the sofa, clutching the drawing. A single tear broke free, tracking a hot, unaccustomed path down her cheek. She hastily wiped it away, terrified of the vulnerability it represented. David returned to the living room a few minutes later. He held 2 mismatched glasses containing a generous pour of cheap amber whiskey. He handed one to Claire and sat in a worn armchair opposite the sofa. The silence stretched, heavy with the unspoken weight of the evening. "She doesn't give those drawings to everyone." David took a slow sip of the whiskey, his dark eyes studying Claire's face. "She sees past the armor." "I don't have any armor left." Claire looked down at her glass, swirling the liquid. "Arthur stripped it all away. I am sitting in a basement in Brooklyn holding a crayon drawing, and I realize I have absolutely nothing of value in my entire life." "You have your life." David leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "Elena didn't get that luxury." The mention of his wife brought the temperature in the room down 10 degrees. The raw, unresolved grief hung between them, a dangerous, volatile element. "You never told me the details." Claire spoke carefully, attempting to navigate the emotional minefield with the clumsy tools of corporate diplomacy. "About the accident." David stared at the corkboard, his gaze locked on the photograph of Elena. The memories were a physical pressure in his skull. "It wasn't an accident." His voice was flat, deadened by repetition. "It was an execution. She was driving back from Hartford. She had secured the final witness testimony necessary for the grand jury indictment. The state police report claimed the brake lines suffered catastrophic stress failure due to road debris. But I saw the photographs from the impound lot before the feds classified the file. The lines weren't stressed, they were sheared, clean surgical cuts." Claire shifted uncomfortably on the sofa. The horror of the reality was suffocating. She reached for the familiar sterile language of her profession, a desperate attempt to create emotional distance. "I am profoundly sorry for your loss, David." Her voice slipped back into the clipped, precise cadence of a CEO issuing a public statement. "The systemic failure of the investigation is a tragedy. When we recover the servers, we will optimize the legal strategy. We will ensure the proper authorities are leveraged to reopen the inquiry. David set his whiskey glass down on the small coffee table with a sharp, resonant crack. The sound severed her sentence instantly. He stood up, his physical presence dominating the small room. He crossed the distance between them, stopping inches from the edge of the sofa. He looked down at her, his eyes blazing with a sudden, terrifying intensity that burned away the quiet domesticity of the evening. Stop. The word was a command, immovable and absolute. Claire froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. Don't do that! David's voice dropped to a low, dangerous rumble. Don't manage my grief. Don't optimize my tragedy. Don't throw your hollow corporate garbage at the memory of my wife. I was just trying to... Look at me! David demanded, his gaze locking onto hers, refusing to allow her to break contact. You spent 10 years turning yourself into a machine because a machine doesn't feel pain. A machine doesn't bleed. But you are not in a boardroom right now. You are in my house. You are sitting where my wife used to sit. Claire's breath caught in her throat. The absolute raw truth of his words stripped away the final layers of her defense mechanisms. I lost my wife. David's voice cracked, a jagged fissure of agony breaking through the immovable stone of his exterior. My daughter lost her mother. Arthur Pendleton stole her future, and the world looked the other way because he possessed the capital to buy their blindness. He leaned closer, demanding the fundamental humanity she had buried so deeply. Say it again. The demand was a quiet, devastating plea. Look at me, Claire. Say it again with your heart. Say it like a human being. Claire stared up at him. The walls crumbled, the ice shattered. The profound, suffocating isolation she had endured for a decade collapsed under the weight of his raw, undeniable pain. She saw the agony in his eyes, the reflection of a love so deep and powerful it transcended death. She realized the utter inadequacy of her sterile, calculated existence. I'm sorry. The words broke from her lips on a ragged, tearing sob. The tears came then, a violent, unstoppable flood. She wept for the woman in the photograph. She wept for the father fighting a desperate war in the shadows. And she wept for herself, for the cold, empty fortress she had built and the life she had wasted defending it. She did not hide her face. She sat on the worn sofa and allowed the vulnerability to consume her. The harsh, ugly sounds of genuine sorrow filling the small living room. David did not offer a polite tissue. He did not offer empty assurances. He reached down, his large, rough hand resting gently on her trembling shoulder. He offered the solid, unyielding weight of a shared humanity. The emotional breakthrough was violent and necessary, an agonizing reset of Claire's fundamental architecture. They sat in the quiet aftermath for a long time, the only sound the distant rhythmic drumming of the rain against the basement windows. But the world outside the sanctuary was not resting. At 2:14 a.m., the fragile peace of the apartment was shattered by the shrill, mechanical shriek of the medical monitor. It was not the rhythmic warning beep of a low oxygen reading. It was a continuous, high-pitched scream of catastrophic system failure. David moved before conscious thought registered the sound. He vaulted over the small coffee table, sprinting down the narrow hallway. Claire scrambled off the sofa, her heart slamming against her sternum, the adrenaline surging back with sickening force. She reached the doorway of the bedroom a fraction of a second behind him. Lily was thrashing violently on the narrow bed, her small hands clawed desperately at her chest. Her eyes wide and unseeing, rolling back into her head. Her skin, previously pale, was rapidly taking on a terrifying cyanotic blue hue. The pulse oximeter clipped to her finger was flashing a critical failure warning. Heart rate plunging. Oxygen saturation critical. Lily! David roared, a sound of pure primal terror. He ripped the standard oxygen tubing away, grabbing a high-flow pediatric mask from the emergency kit stationed at the foot of the bed. He clamped it over her nose and mouth, his massive hands trembling as he cranked the oxygen concentrator to its absolute maximum output. Call 911. David did not look at Claire. His hands moved to Lily's chest, feeling for the erratic, failing rhythm of her heart. Tell them pediatric cardiac arrest, tetralogy of Fallot. We need an advanced life support unit immediately. Claire fumbled in her pocket, pulling out her burner phone. Her fingers slipped on the glass screen, slick with sudden sweat. She dialed the numbers, her voice remarkably steady despite the chaotic terror unfolding before her. She relayed the information with the clinical precision David demanded, her corporate training finally serving a vital purpose. David initiated chest compressions. His large, powerful hands pressed down on the small, fragile sternum with terrifying, calculated force. He counted out loud, his voice a harsh, desperate bark in the small room. Stay with me, little bird. He pressed down. Don't you dare let go. You fight. The next 12 minutes were a blur of agonizing, suspended reality. The wail of the ambulance sirens cut through the Brooklyn night, a sound that promised salvation but offered no guarantees. Paramedics flooded the small apartment, a chaotic intrusion of heavy boots, medical bags, and sharp, authoritative commands. They swept David aside, taking over the compressions, establishing an intraosseous line in Lily's small leg when a peripheral vein proved impossible to find in her collapsing circulatory system. Claire stood pressed against the wall of the hallway, watching the nightmare unfold. She saw David, the immovable force, backed into a corner, his hands covered in sweat, his eyes wide and hollow with a terror so absolute it defied description. They loaded Lily onto a pediatric stretcher, the small form swallowed by the massive wires, tubes, and emergency equipment. We're moving, the lead paramedic shouted, pushing the stretcher toward the door. Dad, you ride up front. David grabbed his coat, pausing only for a fraction of a second to look at Claire. Stay here. His voice was a ragged rasp. Lock the door. He vanished up the stairwell, following the flashing red lights into the rain. Claire stood alone in the sudden, echoing silence of the apartment. The medical monitor on the nightstand continued to emit a flat, continuous tone until she reached over and brutally severed the power cord. The silence that followed was worse than the alarm. She walked back into the living room, staring at the corkboard. The chaotic web of Arthur Pendleton's crimes stared back at her. The money, the power, the systemic corruption. It all meant absolutely nothing in the face of a failing heart. She paced the small room, the adrenaline burning in her veins, demanding action. She could not simply wait. She pulled out the burner phone. She needed resources. She needed leverage. She needed to access the private emergency funds she maintained in a secure offshore trust completely isolated from Kensington Financial. She needed to ensure David had the financial power to demand the absolute best surgical intervention in the city. She navigated to the encrypted portal of the Swiss banking consortium. She entered her complex biometric sequence, verifying her identity through the retinal scanner on the secure device. The screen loaded, a rotating blue circle indicating the connection protocol. The screen flashed red. Access denied. Asset freeze executed pursuant to federal injunction. Claire stared at the words, her mind struggling to process the information. The Swiss accounts were untouchable. They were structured through layers of blind trusts, specifically designed to withstand domestic corporate litigation. The only way an injunction could reach those assets was if a federal grand jury had issued a sweeping criminal indictment under the Patriot Act, classifying her funds as the proceeds of an international money laundering syndicate. Arthur hadn't just fired her. He had anticipated her survival strategies. He had weaponized his connections within the Justice Department, using the $47 million ghosting scheme to paint her, not just as an embezzler but as an international criminal. Her phone vibrated in her hand, an incoming call from an unknown blocked number. She answered, pressing the phone to her ear. Claire. Arthur Pendleton's voice flowed through the speaker, smooth, cultured, and dripping with poisonous satisfaction. I truly hope you haven't attempted to access your secondary reserves. I would hate for the international banking authorities to log your geographic location. You orchestrated a federal injunction. Her voice was ice, the terror replaced by a sudden absolute clarity of hatred. I merely presented the forensic data to my contacts at the Bureau. Arthur's tone was conversational, as if discussing the weather. The Cayman routing numbers you so helpfully established provided the necessary probable cause. Warrants have been issued for your arrest, Claire. You are currently a fugitive. You won't survive the audit, Arthur. She paced the length of the living room, her eyes locked on the corkboard. The data leaves a trail that currently leads directly to you. A soft, dark chuckle echoed over the line. I understand you sought refuge with the custodial staff. David Brooks, a fascinating individual. I ran a deeper background check after his little theatrical performance in the boardroom. It seems his late wife possessed a similarly troublesome inclination toward forensic investigation. The blood drained from Claire's face. Arthur knew. He knew who David was. The sanctuary was breached. The police will be at that Brooklyn address in approximately 20 minutes. Arthur delivered the final blow with surgical precision. Run, Claire. Run as fast and as far as you can, but understand this. Your life as you knew it is over. The line went dead. Claire stood frozen, the phone gripped tightly in her hand. She looked at the corkboard. She looked at the drawing Lily had given her, resting on the coffee table. She had 20 minutes before the authorities kicked the door down. 20 minutes before the trap closed entirely. She grabbed her trench coat. She did not run. She walked out of the apartment, locking the heavy metal door behind her. She walked up the concrete stairs into the driving rain. She needed to find David. She needed to warn him. But more importantly, she needed to stand with him. The Ice Queen was dead, shattered in the basement of a Brooklyn brownstone. The woman walking through the storm was entirely human, fueled by a terrifying, absolute determination to destroy the monster who had taken everything from them. The chaotic, fluorescent-drenched environment of the pediatric intensive care unit was a sensory nightmare. The air smelled of strong antiseptic and visceral human fear. The rhythmic beeping of dozens of medical monitors created a discordant symphony of suffering. David stood outside the glass-walled isolation room, his massive frame rigid, his hands pressed flat against the cold glass. Inside, a team of cardiothoracic surgeons and critical care nurses surrounded Lily's bed. They worked with frantic, synchronized urgency, adjusting ventilator settings, pushing intravenous medications, fighting to stabilize the catastrophic pressure cascade in her failing pulmonary artery. The lead surgeon, a woman with exhausted eyes above her surgical mask, stepped out of the room. She pulled the mask down, meeting David's desperate gaze. "We stabilized the immediate arrhythmia." The surgeon's voice was clinical, offering no false hope. "But the right ventricular outflow tract is completely obstructed. The medication is a temporary bridge. She needs the full corrective reconstructive surgery immediately, within the next 12 hours, or her heart will simply stop." "Then do the surgery." David's voice was a low, desperate plea. "Prep the OR. I'll sign whatever consents you need." The surgeon looked down at the clipboard in her hands, her expression shifting to one of profound bureaucratic discomfort. "Mr. Brooks, we have a significant administrative complication." She hesitated, hating the words she was forced to deliver. "The Hospital Billing Administration ran the preliminary authorization for the surgical suite. Your primary insurance provider has flagged the procedure. They are maintaining their previous denial, classifying the reconstructive technique as experimental. They have placed an immediate hard stop on the surgical authorization." David stared at her, the words echoing in his skull like a death knell. "She is dying in that room. You are telling me you won't operate because a clerk in a cubicle denied a billing code?" "I am a surgeon, Mr. Brooks. I don't control the hospital administration." The surgeon looked genuinely pained. "They require a catastrophic out-of-pocket deposit to bypass the insurance denial and open the surgical suite. $2 million, cash or wire transfer, verified before the anesthesiologist begins the protocol." $2 million. It was a number so astronomically disconnected from his reality that it felt like a cruel, abstract joke. He possessed $300 in a checking account and a mountain of debt. His daughter's life possessed a precise, unyielding price tag, and he was completely, utterly bankrupt. "I will get the money." David's voice possessed a terrifying, hollow certainty. "Keep her alive. I will get the money." The surgeon nodded slowly, turning back into the isolation room. David backed away from the glass. The hospital corridor seemed to stretch, the walls tilting inward. The absolute crushing weight of his failure threatened to drive him to his knees. He had fought the entire world. He had tracked an untouchable criminal. He had maintained his dignity. And it was not enough. The system was designed to crush the poor, to deny them the basic fundamental right to life. It is a tragic flaw in the American healthcare system, isn't it? The voice, smooth, cultured, and entirely out of place in the chaotic hospital corridor, sliced through David's panic. He turned. Arthur Pendleton stood at the far end of the hallway. He wore a bespoke charcoal overcoat, a silk scarf draped perfectly around his neck. He looked completely unruffled, an immaculate predator strolling through a slaughterhouse. David felt a sudden violent surge of adrenaline. The grief and terror vanished, replaced by an explosive primal rage. He took a step forward, his hands balling into massive, lethal fists. He intended to tear the man apart right there in the sterile corridor. Arthur raised a hand, a gesture of calm superiority. He reached into the inner pocket of his overcoat. He slowly withdrew a narrow slip of crisp, heavy stock paper. "Violence will not save your daughter, Mr. Brooks." Arthur's voice was a low, poisonous murmur. "In fact, your arrest for assault will merely ensure she dies entirely alone in that glass box." David stopped, his breathing harsh, jagged gasps. The logic of the threat was undeniable. Arthur stepped closer, the scent of expensive cologne masking the hospital antiseptic. He held the slip of paper out. It was a cashier's check, drawn on a major domestic bank, payable to the hospital administration. The amount written on the line was exactly $2 million. David stared at the numbers. The paper represented salvation. It represented breath in his daughter's lungs. It represented a future. "I admire your persistence, David." Arthur offered a cold, patronizing smile. "I truly do. You spent 4 years building an impressive dossier. You possess a remarkable intellect. It is a shame your wife did not possess the same survival instincts." David's jaw clamped shut, his teeth grinding together with enough force to crack enamel. He forced himself to look away from the check, locking his eyes onto Arthur's pale, empty gaze. "What do you want?" The words tasted like blood in his mouth. "I want the architecture you built in your living room." Arthur stated his terms with the casual authority of a king negotiating a surrender. "I want every encrypted drive, every physical document, every scrap of forensic data you compiled regarding my financial history. I want your absolute permanent silence regarding the unfortunate accident on the interstate 4 years ago." Arthur took another step, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "And I want Claire Kensington. I know she is with you. The police are currently executing a search warrant at your apartment. When she contacts you, you will provide her location to my security team. She will take the fall for the $47 million. She goes to federal prison. I take the company. You take the money and save your daughter." The devil's bargain was presented with flawless, terrifying clarity. Arthur held the check closer. "Take the paper, David. Go to the billing administration. Open the surgical suite. Be the father your daughter needs." David looked at the check. The temptation was a physical force, a gravitational pull threatening to drag him into the abyss. If he took the money, Lily lived. She would grow up. She would go to school. She would color with vibrant yellow crayons. All he had to do was sell his soul. All he had to do was become the accomplice to the man who murdered his wife. All he had to do was sacrifice an innocent woman to a corrupt system. He looked through the glass window into the isolation room. He saw Lily's small, fragile form. He saw the monitor displaying the desperate, failing rhythm of her heart. He saw Elena's eyes staring back at him from his daughter's vote. He closed his eyes, the memory of his wife surging through him. Elena had died fighting this exact monster. She had refused to compromise. She had refused to turn a blind eye to the corruption, even when it cost her everything. If he took the money, he would invalidate her sacrifice. He would build his daughter's life on a foundation of blood and profound, irreversible cowardice. Lily did not just need a father. She needed a father she could respect. She needed a father who embodied the bravery she saw in him. David opened his eyes. The terror was gone. The desperation was gone. Only the absolute, immovable bedrock of his character remained. He reached out. Arthur smiled, anticipating the surrender. The predator always assumed the prey would break under the pressure of survival. David's large, calloused fingers closed around the cashier's check. He did not pull it toward himself. He gripped the heavy stock paper firmly. With a slow, deliberate, and devastatingly precise motion, David tore the check in half. Arthur's smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of profound, uncomprehending shock. David placed the torn halves together and ripped them again, reducing the $2 million to useless, jagged confetti. He let the pieces fall to the sterile linoleum floor, scattering across the polished surface. "I have dignity." David's voice rumbled through the corridor, carrying the force of a seismic event. "I deserve respect. My daughter needs a father who can hold his head high, not a coward who sold her mother's memory to a murderer." Arthur stared at the torn paper on the floor, the fundamental laws of his universe, suddenly collapsing. He could not comprehend a man who would choose honor over survival. "You just killed her," Arthur hissed, the polished veneer cracking to reveal the terrified, vicious animal beneath. "She is going to die in there, and it is your fault." "No." David stepped into Arthur's personal space, his physical dominance absolute. "She is going to live, and you are going to prison. I don't need your money. I am going to tear your empire down, and I am going to do it tonight." David turned his back on the chief financial officer. He did not look back. He walked to the nurse's station, his stride long and purposeful. "My daughter needs that surgery." David spoke to the charge nurse, his tone commanding, leaving absolutely no room for debate. "Keep her stable. I will have the authorization code from the hospital administration in exactly 2 hours." He walked out of the intensive care unit, the doors swinging shut behind him. He possessed no money. He possessed no legal leverage. He was a man operating entirely on the fuel of absolute moral clarity. He pulled his burner phone from his pocket as he entered the elevator. He dialed the secondary number Claire had provided. She answered on the first ring, the sound of driving rain audible in the background. "The apartment is compromised." Claire's voice was breathless. "Arthur called me. The police are executing a warrant. I'm blocks away." "I know." David watched the floor numbers descend on the digital display. "He's here, at the hospital. He tried to buy the evidence." "Did he?" Claire hesitated, terrified of the answer. "Did he offer the money for the surgery?" "Yes." "David." Her voice cracked, understanding the impossible agony of the choice. "Lily." "I tore the check up." David stated the fact simply. "I don't negotiate with terrorists. Are you near a subway line?" Silence stretched over the line for a long second, followed by a sharp, slightly hysterical exhalation of breath. It was the sound of a woman realizing she had finally placed her trust in exactly the right human being. "I'm at the Nostrand Avenue station." "Take the A train into Manhattan." David stepped out of the elevator into the hospital lobby. "Get off at Fulton Street. Meet me at the service entrance of the Kensington building in 45 minutes. "The building is locked down," Claire protested, the logic of her corporate training attempting to reassert itself. "Arthur will have security on high alert. My physical access won't clear the external doors. I'm not using your access for the external doors." David pushed through the revolving glass doors, stepping out into the brutal, relentless storm. "I'm the janitor. I have the master override keys for the service docks. David, if we breach the physical server room, it triggers a silent alarm to federal authorities. We will have less than 10 minutes before an armed response unit locks down the entire grid. Then we have 10 minutes to download the Genesis block, expose a massive international fraud, and steal $2 million from Arthur Pendleton's personal offshore accounts to pay for my daughter's surgery. David walked into the rain, his posture unbending against the wind. We are going to war, Claire. He spoke into the phone, his voice cutting through the storm. Are you ready to burn your house down? Light the match. Claire's voice echoed back, forged into absolute unbreakable steel. The line disconnected. The subterranean cavern of the Fulton Street subway station smelled of ozone, damp concrete, and the metallic friction of the rails. The 3:14 a.m. local train screamed to a halt, the doors sliding open to expel a single passenger into the flickering fluorescent gloom. Claire stepped onto the platform, her expensive trench coat plastered to her skin, her designer shoes ruined by the torrential Manhattan downpour. The physical discomfort was irrelevant. The corporate titan had been entirely stripped away, leaving only a woman operating on raw, desperate adrenaline. She navigated the turnstiles, her eyes scanning the shadowy alcoves near the service exits. The heavy iron door at the far end of the platform creaked open. The silhouette of a man filled the narrow frame, broad-shouldered and immovable against the dim light of the maintenance tunnel. You made it. David's low rumble resonated over the ambient noise of the empty station. The security patrols rotate in 12 minutes. We have a vanishingly small window to cross the subterranean grid. Lead the way. Claire did not hesitate. They plunged into the forgotten arteries of the city. The service tunnels beneath the financial district formed a labyrinth of rusted pipes, exposed wiring, and century-old brickwork. David moved with the practiced, silent grace of a man who had spent his life studying the architecture of shadows. He did not use a flashlight. He navigated by memory and the faint, ghostly illumination bleeding through the overhead grates. The physical exertion demanded everything Claire possessed. The air grew thicker, heavy with the suffocating heat of the city's steam system. Every scraping footstep, every distant groan of shifting metal threatened to shatter her nerve, but the image of a 7-year-old girl suffocating in a sterile hospital bed propelled her forward. The building foundation is just ahead. David stopped, raising a hand to halt her momentum. This is the primary service lock. The master key I copied only bypasses the analog deadbolt. The digital proximity sensor is still active. When I turn this cylinder, the system will register an unscheduled maintenance entry. The night supervisor will dispatch a guard to visually clear the corridor. How long do we have before they arrive? 4 minutes. David inserted a heavy brass key into the corroded lock of a reinforced steel door. The sub-basement server room is a 2-minute sprint down the central corridor. We will have 120 seconds to breach the biometric seal before the guards turn the corner. The heavy tumblers fell into place with a deafening metallic clack. David hauled the heavy door open. The transition was jarring. They stepped out of the subterranean grit and into the pristine, brightly lit, hyper-sterile environment of Kensington Financial's deepest level. The floor was polished white epoxy, the walls were seamless acoustic panels, the silence was absolute, humming with the invisible current of massive electrical conduits. Run! David bolted down the corridor. Claire pushed her exhausted muscles to their absolute limit, sprinting alongside him. Her breath tore at her throat, the ruined heels of her shoes echoing like gunshots against the pristine flooring. The corridor stretched endlessly, a sterile white tunnel leading to the heart of the corporate machine. At the far end, a massive blast-resistant door loomed, devoid of handles or keyholes. A single sleek biometric scanner pulsed with a soft, pulsing blue ring on the adjacent wall. David skidded to a halt, his chest heaving. He pointed to the optical glass. The termination protocol hasn't propagated to the air-gapped physical security nodes yet. Claire pressed her thumb firmly against the glass. It takes 48 hours for the administrative server to overwrite the basement mainframe. The blue ring spun, analyzing the intricate ridges of her fingerprint, cross-referencing the data against the localized biometric database. The seconds evaporated. 1, 2, 3. The agonizing delay felt like a physical weight pressing down on their shoulders. The distant rhythmic squeak of rubber-soled security boots echoed from the far end of the corridor. The patrol was approaching. The ring flashed emerald green. A deep, hydraulic hiss resonated through the concrete. The blast door unsealed, retreating into the wall with agonizing slowness. David grabbed Claire's arm, hauling her through the narrow gap before the door had fully opened. He slammed his hand against the interior emergency override button. The door reversed direction, sealing shut with a definitive, airtight thud just as the flashlight beams of the security patrol swept across the polished floor outside. They stood in the dark, breathing heavily. The air inside the room was freezing, chilled to a precise 62 degrees to prevent the massive hardware banks from melting down. David reached into his bag, pulling out a small, high-powered tactical flashlight. The beam sliced through the darkness, illuminating rows of towering, black monolithic server racks. Thousands of status lights blinked in a chaotic, mesmerizing constellation of green and amber. This was the true vault of Kensington Financial. Not gold, not paper currency, but pure, unfiltered data. The primary air gap node is at the center of the array. David moved down the narrow aisle between the humming machines. It records every physical hardware interaction, every terminal login, every VoIP communication packet that bypasses the cloud servers. It is the infallible memory of the corporation. He stopped before a standalone terminal, resting on a brushed steel console. He unzipped his messenger bag, extracting his customized, heavily encrypted laptop and a thick bundle of fiber optic cables. He did not waste a single motion. He bypassed the standard interface ports, unscrewing the protective faceplate of the console to hardwire his system directly into the motherboard of the primary node. The moment I initiate the handshake protocol, the system will recognize an unauthorized hardware bridge. David's fingers hovered over his keyboard. It will not trigger an audible alarm, but a silent distress signal will instantly transmit to the Federal Cybersecurity Task Force in Lower Manhattan. An armed response unit will be dispatched immediately. We will have less than 8 minutes before they seal the perimeter and flood the basement. 8 minutes to find the Genesis block, expose Arthur, and save Lily. Claire stepped closer to the screen, the freezing air biting through her damp clothes. Execute the command. David struck the enter key. The laptop screen erupted into a chaotic waterfall of scrolling code. The digital architecture of the air-gapped node fought back, deploying aggressive firewall countermeasures and localized encryption walls. David's hands became a blur, his mind operating at a terrifying velocity, countering the automated defenses, deploying specialized decryption algorithms he had spent 4 years perfecting in the solitude of his basement. Bypassing the first layer, David's eyes darted across the cascading text. Accessing the physical terminal logs, filtering for Arthur Pendleton's unique executive MAC address during the 18-month window of the ghost payroll scheme. A progress bar appeared on the screen, crawling forward with excruciating slowness. 5%, 10%. The temperature in the room seemed to drop further. The hum of the servers felt like a physical vibration in Claire's teeth. Match! David slammed his palm on the desk. Got it. October 14th, 2:14 a.m. Arthur's personal terminal established a direct bridge to the Human Resources Biometric Database. The logs confirm he downloaded a perfect digital replica of your physical fingerprint hash. 3 minutes later, he used that cloned hash to authorize the initial $3 million transfer to the Delaware Dummy Corporation. Download the log. Claire gripped the edge of the console. That proves the $47 million was a synthetic frame job. I'm pulling it down now. David initiated the file transfer. But it's not enough. It proves fraud. It doesn't prove murder. I need the VoIP archive. He opened a new command window. his keystrokes hammering against the plastic. He targeted the deeply buried, supposedly secure voice-over Internet protocol servers. Arthur had been arrogant. He had believed the internal corporate network was utterly impenetrable, shielded from federal wiretaps and subpoena authority. He had used his desk phone to conduct the darkest business of his life, filtering audio packets. David murmured, the tension radiating from his massive shoulders. Date parameter November 10th, 2 days before Elena's accident. Destination number, Hartford, Connecticut area code. The screen flashed. A single compressed audio file materialized in the directory. David hesitated. His finger hovered over the trackpad. For 4 years he had chased a ghost. He had built a wall of evidence based on financial anomalies, routing numbers, and circumstantial timelines. But this file represented the visceral, undeniable reality of his wife's murder. "Play it." Claire's voice was a soft, steady anchor in the freezing room. David clicked the file. The audio was crystal clear, uncorrupted by cellular interference. Arthur Pendleton's smooth, aristocratic baritone filled the server room, chilling the air far more effectively than the climate control. "The federal grand jury convenes in 3 weeks. Agent Brooks has the final witness. The indictment is inevitable if she reaches that courthouse." A second voice, rough, uneducated, laced with casual brutality, responded. "I told you, Mr. Pendleton. The price goes up for a federal badge. It's messy. It draws too much heat. $50,000 has already been routed to the secondary Cayman account." Arthur's voice was completely devoid of human empathy. "Make it look like catastrophic mechanical failure. The interstate through Hartford is notoriously dangerous in the rain. Ensure she does not arrive." The audio file ended with a sharp, digital click. David stared at the screen, his entire body locked in rigid, terrifying paralysis. Hearing the explicit calculated order, hearing the exact price placed upon the life of the woman he loved, threatened to shatter his sanity. The primal, violent rage he had suppressed for years clawed at his throat, demanding to be unleashed. He wanted to tear the servers apart with his bare hands. He wanted to find Arthur and beat the life out of him on the marble floor of the boardroom. Claire placed her hand over his, her touch grounding him, pulling him back from the precipice of pure violence. "We have the weapon, David." She looked at the audio file currently transferring to his encrypted drive. "Now we take the money." The reminder of his daughter's failing heart instantly recalibrated his focus. The rage solidified into cold, absolute mechanical precision. 4 minutes remaining until the Federal Response Unit breaches the perimeter. David opened a third command window, bypassing the standard financial interface and accessing the raw underlying routing architecture of the global banking network. "I have the routing numbers for Arthur's personal offshore accounts, the ones he funded with the ghost payroll." He executed the breach. The screen displayed the staggering balance of Arthur Pendleton's hidden wealth, over $200 million resting in the dark corners of the international banking system. "I am not stealing." David's fingers flew across the keyboard, setting up the transfer protocol. "I am executing a forced systemic redistribution. Destination, the Pediatric Intensive Care Billing Administration of New York Presbyterian Hospital. Amount, $2 million. Exactly. Transfer initiated." The progress bar appeared, racing across the screen. Suddenly, the sterile white lighting of the server room vanished, replaced by a strobing, aggressive, blood-red emergency glow. A harsh, mechanical siren began to wail, vibrating the acoustic panels. "The Federal Breach Protocol has activated." David grabbed the fiber-optic cables, yanking them free from the motherboard. "The external doors are locking down. The physical server room will seal permanently in 60 seconds. "Is the transfer complete?" Claire grabbed her coat. David stared at the laptop screen. The progress bar hovered at 99%. The encryption handshake with the hospital billing department was agonizingly slow. "Come on," David growled, his jaw clenched. "Clear, just clear." The siren escalated in pitch. The heavy blast door began to groan, the hydraulic mechanisms engaging to permanently entomb the room. The screen flashed brilliant green. Transfer complete. Funds verified. David slammed the laptop shut, shoving it into the messenger bag. Move! They sprinted toward the closing blast door. The gap was narrowing rapidly, the massive steel slab sliding relentlessly across the threshold. David threw himself sideways, sliding across the polished epoxy floor, his broad shoulders scraping against the metal frame as he squeezed through the diminishing aperture. Claire dove after him, David catching her arm and hauling her through with brutal force just as the door slammed shut with a deafening final boom, sealing the server room completely. They scrambled to their feet in the red-lit corridor. The sound of shouting voices and heavy tactical gear echoed from the main stairwell. The armed response unit had arrived. The utility shaft. David pointed to a recessed maintenance panel in the wall. It drops directly into the city's main storm drain infrastructure. It's going to be rough. I don't care. Claire ripped the panel open, revealing a dark vertical drop lined with rusted iron rungs. I am not losing this war now. They descended into absolute darkness, the sounds of the security sweep fading above them. They waded through knee-deep, freezing water in the storm drains, navigating by the faint beam of David's tactical flashlight. The physical toll was immense, their bodies battered and exhausted. But the encrypted drive resting in David's bag radiated a heat that sustained them. They possessed the undeniable, unassailable truth. Dawn was breaking over the East River when the taxi pulled up to the main entrance of the hospital. The storm had finally broken, leaving behind a sky of bruised purple and pale, fragile gold. David and Claire burst through the revolving doors, completely ignoring the startled glances of the morning shift nurses. They were covered in soot, damp from the storm drains, smelling of ozone and desperation. They reached the surgical administration desk. The clerk looked up, startled by their appearance. Lily Brooks! David slammed his hand flat on the counter, his chest heaving. Check the billing authorization queue. Now! The clerk, intimidated by his sheer physical presence, hurriedly typed the name into the terminal. Her eyes widened as she read the screen. Mr. Brooks. The clerk looked up, her expression transforming from annoyance to profound respect. The $2 million wire transfer cleared 10 minutes ago. It originated from a secure offshore trust. The surgical suite was immediately unlocked. Dr. Aris took your daughter into the operating room 5 minutes ago. The reconstructive procedure has begun. The absolute, overwhelming relief hit David with the force of a falling building. His knees buckled slightly. The immovable fortress of a man finally ceded, the adrenaline evaporating, leaving nothing but the raw, terrifying vulnerability of a father waiting for a verdict. He collapsed into one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs in the waiting area, burying his face in his large, scarred hands. A long, shuddering breath escaped his chest, a sound carrying 4 years of suppressed agony and terror. Claire sat in the chair beside him. She did not offer empty platitudes. She did not attempt to manage his emotional state. She understood with absolute clarity that love was not a transaction. It was an absolute surrender. She reached out, placing her hand firmly over his. David did not pull away. He turned his hand over, his fingers wrapping around hers, gripping her hand with the strength of a drowning man holding a lifeline. They sat in the sterile waiting room for 6 agonizing hours. They did not speak. Words were utterly insufficient to address the magnitude of the moment. They shared the profound, terrifying silence of the vigil. At noon, the heavy double doors of the surgical wing swung open. Dr. Aris emerged, still wearing her surgical scrubs, her mask pulled down around her neck. She looked exhausted, but her eyes possessed a distinct, unmistakable brightness. David stood up, his heart hammering against his ribs. The reconstruction was flawless. Dr. Aris offered a small, genuine smile. We successfully repaired the right ventricular outflow tract and patched the septal defect. Her heart is beating on its own. The oxygen saturation is holding at 99%. She is a fighter, Mr. Brooks. She is going to be fine. Tears, hot and undeniable, spilled over David's eyelashes, tracking down his cheeks. The nightmare was over. The engine was fixed. His little bird was going to fly. He turned to Claire. The Ice Queen was gone. The woman standing before him was crying freely, her face streaked with dirt and tears, her expression radiating a profound, luminous joy. "She's safe." David's voice was a ragged whisper. "She's safe," Claire echoed, wiping her eyes. David looked at the wall clock. It was 12:15 in the afternoon. "The annual shareholder meeting." David's voice hardened, the joy seamlessly transitioning into cold, absolute resolve. Arthur scheduled the emergency ratification vote for 1 o'clock in the main penthouse boardroom. He expects to be officially crowned CEO in front of the entire board of directors and the primary institutional investors. Claire nodded, her own posture straightening, the warrior returning to the forefront of her mind. "He thinks I'm a fugitive. He thinks you took the money and ran. Let's go show him exactly who we are." An hour later, the atmosphere inside the penthouse boardroom of Kensington Financial was intoxicatingly triumphant. The storm had scrubbed the city clean and brilliant, blinding sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows. 50 of the most powerful individuals in global finance sat around the massive, custom-built table. At the head of the table stood Arthur Pendleton. He wore a flawless, bespoke charcoal suit. He radiated the calm, benevolent authority of a savior who had steered the ship through a catastrophic storm. "The unfortunate actions of my predecessor are a stain upon the legacy of this institution." Arthur's baritone voice projected effortlessly across the room. "Claire Kensington betrayed our trust. She orchestrated a massive $47 million fraud, channeling the funds into personal offshore accounts. The federal authorities have issued warrants for her arrest. However, I assure you the underlying assets of this company remain completely secure. Under my leadership, we will implement aggressive, unassailable compliance protocols. We will rebuild the trust of the market, and we will emerge stronger, leaner, and infinitely more profitable." A murmur of approval rippled around the table. The institutional investors nodded, satisfied with the narrative, eager to return to the business of accumulating wealth. The heavy oak doors at the far end of the boardroom swung open with a loud, reverberating crash. The murmur of approval instantly died, replaced by a shocked, breathless silence. David Brooks stepped into the room. He was no longer wearing faded blue coveralls. He was no longer the invisible man pushing a plastic cart. He wore a tailored, immaculately cut black suit. He carried himself with the terrifying, absolute authority of a man who possessed the power to destroy the room with a single word. He was a force of nature, an immovable object, demanding an immediate reckoning. Claire Kensington walked beside him, her head held high, radiating a cold, unyielding fury that dwarfed the power she had ever possessed as CEO. Arthur Pendleton froze mid-sentence. The blood drained from his face, leaving a sickly, ashen pallor. His eyes darted toward the doors, searching frantically for his security detail. "Security!" Arthur's voice cracked, a high-pitched sound of pure panic. "Remove these people. The woman is a federal fugitive." The two security guards stationed inside the room stepped forward, but David did not even look at them. He kept his eyes locked onto Arthur, his stride eating up the distance between the doors and the presentation console. "Truth does not negotiate with the dark," David's voice boomed through the boardroom, freezing the guards in their tracks with its sheer, absolute command. "And it cannot be buried beneath corrupted ledgers." David reached the console. He pulled the encrypted drive from his pocket and jammed it into the primary USB port. His fingers danced across the presentation keyboard, bypassing Arthur's slideshow with contemptuous ease. The massive projection screens behind Arthur flickered, then erupted with data. "Page 1. David did not yell. He spoke with the clinical, devastating precision of a forensic surgeon dissecting a tumor. "The authentic server logs from the air-gapped security node in the sub-basement. Time-stamped October 14th. This proves Arthur Pendleton used his personal executive terminal to clone the biometric fingerprint hash of Claire Kensington." The board members gasped, leaning forward, their eyes scanning the undeniable verified MAC addresses displaying on the screens. Page 2. David struck the keyboard again. The routing architecture of the ghost payroll scheme. The $47 million was not stolen by Claire Kensington. It was systematically aggregated over 18 months by Arthur Pendleton, routed through a defunct Delaware subsidiary and deposited into a Cayman Islands account registered under a blind trust controlled entirely by him. "This is a fabrication!" Arthur shouted, his voice shrill, sweat beading on his forehead. "He is an associate of hers, a hired hacker. The data is manufactured. A fortress built on lies will eventually crumble under the weight of a single honest man." David ignored the outburst, turning to face the assembled board of directors. "Arthur Pendleton is a thief, but theft is the least of his sins." David struck the enter key one final time. The screens went black. The crystal-clear audio of the VoIP recording filled the stunned silence of the boardroom. "The federal grand jury convenes in 3 weeks. Make it look like catastrophic mechanical failure. The interstate through Hartford is notoriously dangerous in the rain. Ensure she does not arrive." Arthur's own voice, cold, calculating, and dripping with murderous intent, echoed off the mahogany panels. The silence that followed the recording was absolute. It was the silence of a room realizing they had been sitting in the presence of a monster. The institutional investors stared at Arthur with open, unmasked horror. The chairman of the board, his face pale, slowly stood up from his chair, backing away from the chief financial officer. Arthur looked around the room, the realization of his total, irreversible destruction crashing down upon him. The polished veneer was entirely gone. He looked small, pathetic, and terrifyingly ordinary. He lunged toward the console, a desperate, feral attempt to destroy the drive. David stepped into his path, his massive chest blocking the console. He did not strike Arthur. He did not need to. The sheer physical reality of David's presence forced Arthur to stumble backward, defeated by a man who refused to break. The boardroom doors opened again. A team of federal agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation entered the room. Their badges displayed prominently, their expressions grim and purposeful. David had automated the decryption of the audio file, transmitting the entire dossier directly to the director of the FBI the moment the surgical wire transfer had cleared. "Arthur Pendleton." The lead agent stepped forward, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, wire fraud, and violation of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act." Arthur did not resist. He extended his wrists, his eyes locked on David, filled with a mixture of hatred and profound, uncomprehending shock. He could not understand how the architecture of his power had been dismantled by a man who refused to accept a $2 million bribe. The handcuffs clicked shut with a sharp, metallic finality. The sound was the loudest thing David had ever heard. It was the sound of a 4-year hunt coming to a definitive, undeniable end. The agents escorted Arthur out of the boardroom, the doors swinging shut behind him, removing the poison from the room permanently. The chairman of the board stood at the head of the table, his hands trembling slightly as he attempted to process the catastrophic revelation. He looked at Claire, then looked at David, realizing the magnitude of the intelligence and moral fortitude standing before him. "Mr. Brooks." The chairman cleared his throat, attempting to salvage the optics of the disaster. "The board is... We are profoundly horrified by these revelations. We owe you an incalculable debt of gratitude. You have saved this institution from complete systemic collapse. We would like to offer you the position of Executive Vice President of Risk Management. The compensation package will be unprecedented, whatever you require." David looked at the old man. He looked at the faces of the board members, still calculating the market impact of the arrest, still operating within the sterile transactional framework of their reality. He had achieved total victory. He had exposed the corruption. He had secured the bag of justice. "No." David's voice was calm, carrying absolutely no resentment, only the immovable bedrock of his character. My dignity is not for sale, and my time belongs to my daughter. I have finished my business here. The chairman blinked, stunned by the rejection. But the resources, the power you could wield. David turned away from the table, dismissing the most powerful men in the city without a second thought. Claire stepped forward. She looked around the boardroom at the expensive leather chairs, the mahogany table, the glass walls that had defined her entire existence for a decade. She felt nothing. The ambition that had fueled her life had burned away, replaced by a profound, fundamental clarity. I am formally resigning as Chief Executive Officer of Kensington Financial. Claire addressed the board, her voice steady and luminous. The assets have been recovered. The systemic fraud has been excised. You have the data required to rebuild the compliance architecture. Claire, be reasonable, the chairman pleaded. You are vindicated. The company needs your leadership now more than ever. I can rebuild a company, but I cannot rebuild a family. Claire offered a small, genuine smile entirely devoid of malice. I have spent my entire life optimizing portfolios. It is time I optimized my own humanity. Good luck, gentlemen. She turned and walked down the length of the boardroom, her footsteps falling in perfect rhythm with David's. They walked out through the heavy oak doors, leaving the corporate world behind them, stepping into the bright, blinding light of a future they had forged with their own hands. 2 years later, the golden sunlight of a warm Saturday morning filtered through the leaves of a massive oak tree, casting dappled shadows across the manicured lawn of a quiet suburban home in Westchester County. The air smelled of freshly cut grass, blooming hydrangeas, and the sweet, heavy scent of baking cinnamon. David Brooks sat on the wooden deck extending from the back of the house. He wore a simple white t-shirt and faded jeans, reading a thick novel, the deep lines of exhaustion and grief completely erased from his face. He looked relaxed, powerful, and deeply, profoundly at peace. A blur of motion tore across the green lawn. Lily, now 9 years old, was chasing a golden retriever puppy with relentless, boundless energy. She laughed, a bright, clear sound that echoed across the yard. The oxygen tank was a memory. The blue tint around her lips was gone. Above the collar of her summer dress, a faint, thin surgical scar was visible at the base of her throat. Not a mark of tragedy, but a permanent badge of survival, a testament to the war her father had waged to secure her breath. The screen door of the kitchen squeaked open. Claire stepped onto the deck. She was not wearing charcoal armor. She wore a bright floral sundress and a white apron dusted with flour. Her hair was pulled back in a messy knot, and her face was flushed from the heat of the oven. She carried a tray of warm, fresh cinnamon rolls, the icing melting perfectly down the sides. She looked radiant. The cold, isolated executive had been entirely replaced by a woman who had discovered the profound, messy, terrifying joy of genuine connection. She set the tray down on the patio table, wiping her hands on her apron. Lily stopped running, her sharp eyes immediately locking onto the tray of pastries. She sprinted toward the deck, the puppy bounding joyfully at her heels. She skidded to a halt at the bottom of the wooden stairs, looking up at Claire. "I smell cinnamon." Lily grinned, her gap-toothed smile replaced by the neat, straight teeth of a growing chud. She tilted her head, observing Claire with the same intense, unvarnished scrutiny she had used in the damp basement in Brooklyn 2 years prior. Lily pointed a small, flour-dusted finger at the woman on the deck, her eyes bright with a profound, innocent wisdom. "Look, Dad," Lily's voice rang out, clear and triumphant. "She knows how to smile now." Claire laughed, a rich, vibrant sound that filled the morning air. It was a genuine, blindingly beautiful smile reaching all the way to her eyes, reflecting the absolute, undeniable happiness that had taken root in her soul. David closed his book, placing it on the small table. He stood up, closing the distance between them. He looked down at the woman who had walked into the darkness with him. the woman who had chosen to burn her own house down, to stand by his side. He reached out, his large, calloused hand gently wrapping around her fingers. The physical contact was grounding, solid, and infinite. "Yes, she does, little bird." David's voice was a low, resonant rumble filled with the warmth of a man who had finally found his way home. "She absolutely does." They stood together on the wooden deck, watching the child play in the golden sunlight. The monsters had been defeated. The ghosts had been laid to rest. The system had not broken them. They had maintained their dignity. They had fought for the truth, and they had earned every single second of their beautiful, ordinary, miraculous life.